everyone, welcome back to Title IX Insider. Today we're going to be jumping into a little bit more of a discussion on investigations. And we have my amazing colleague Beth here with us today to start us off with this conversation.
So we've already talked about like you do the intake. So now it's the decision of how do we know this is actually going to be a Title IX case or go to conduct or maybe not be reviewed at all. So what would you recommend for someone to look at if they were trying to look at an intake to decide which way it went?
Okay, great. So initially, when an intake does take place, we're looking to see if it will coincide and match with the definition of sexual harassment that is dictated under Title IX. And so specifically looking at, does it really qualify as a sexual harassment case under the Title IX threshold? And from there, we're looking at jurisdiction. Where did the assault or sexual harassment take place? Does it actually impact the education of the individual within the Title IX programming of the school itself? And so those are the key questions that Title IX coordinators look at in order to determine if the case itself should remain within Title IX or go to a different department. In addition to that, we're looking to see if, for example, the individual is also an employee or a student, because if they're not, it may not continue on as a Title IX case. Also, if the complainant themselves comes forward and says, you know what, all these things have happened to me. However, I do not want to file a formal complaint. Please do not do an investigation. Then at that point, we will also not do a Title IX case. And also, we're looking to see if we are set if we as a Title IX coordinator should also dismiss the formal complaint itself. There may be circumstances there that make us have difficulty investigating the situation, and or as mentioned, it does not fall into one of the categories that is listed under Title IX, for example, jurisdiction, or doesn't really fit the definition of sexual harassment under Title IX. And so after all those things are looked at and assessed, once a case actually is determined to be a Title IX case and the formal complaint has come through, it's been signed off, then at that point, the Title IX coordinator will assign an investigator, will also provide a notice of allegation or notice of investigation out to the person that has been accused of some sort of misconduct. And so all of these things take place. And when the investigator is determined and selected, their information will go into the notice of allegation and or investigation. And so someone like Beth, for example, will be tapped on the shoulder and told, hey, this is a case. This is a Title IX case. Please start to work on it and investigate it. And so, for example, Title IX Consulting Group, we would do that with Beth as one of our investigators. And Beth, do you want to talk a little bit about what then takes place from there?
Sure. So the big thing is to be trained because if you have to know the information, how to document properly, things of that nature. So after you have your Title IX investigators group ready, then you can look to see who would be the best person to tap on the shoulder. As an investigator, the biggest thing is to stay unbiased, to make sure you document properly all the information that you receive when you're talking to the different people, witnesses, compliant, anything like that. And then treat everybody with respect because you don't want to go in thinking that you already have made a decision or anything of that nature. All you're doing is investigating. You're asking questions, you're listening thoroughly, you're documenting properly, you're keeping the coordinator abreast of where you're at, who you've reached out to, who you've been able to contact, if you're having contact issues with somebody, all of those things, because you want to make sure that it's a fair and unbiased investigation. So that way you can move forward with anything that would have to happen after.
Great. And so I'm kind of curious, Beth, can you share? I know you've had ample experience with investigations. How many years have you done investigations? And what are some of the things that you've seen when you first start an investigation?
Um, I've been doing it for about 10 years, investigations at different colleges in higher ed. over the time, I've seen everything from you're starting the investigation and you can't get in touch with somebody, but you need to know their side of the situation so that you can have a fair decision made or fair reporting put in. Um, Also making sure that the reporting is always the same. So every person gets the same questions asked, listened the same way. I have seen where um, I've been part of an investigation and I've actually questioned another investigator to see if they were being biased of a situation because it seemed like they already were taking sides when at the time you can't take sides as an investigator. You're just getting the evidence, you're just getting the information, and just reminding yourself of that. Don't get the emotional side in. Um, Listen, give resources. Sometimes people forget that part that when you're doing the investigation, sometimes you have to hand out resources. Anything to help with mental health or other reporting or anything else that comes up in the conversation. So making sure you know all the information around you that's available to give to anybody that's part of it, from a witness to a complainant. And then the biggest thing is just listening and documenting everything. Because if you don't document something, you can't go into a case saying, well, when we were having a conversation, you said this. No. In this documentation, this information is available because otherwise it's more of a hearsay. So you definitely want to make sure you're documenting everything.
Awesome. Do you typically record the investigation conversations that you have with witnesses, the complainant and the respondent, or is it all just written notes? Like, how does it work? Like, what's best practices?
I've done both. It sometimes matters the college that you work at and the training that they give you and they advise you to do. At one college, it was we recorded everything and you had to read off a statement prior to the start of the investigation so that the person knew that they were being recorded. Another one, I had to write out like write out notes, and then I had to read what I wrote to the person for them to sign off. Also at that one, we had the person actually write the statement and then sign off on it. So that way it was known of what was documented during this conversation, what information was taken from this conversation or this situation. Because you really do have to follow the rules of college or the high school or K through 12 or anything that you're working for, because the one thing that will get you in a little bit of trouble if you're the investigator and you're not following the rules of where you work is they'll be like, well, why did you record this? We don't record. Or why didn't you have them sign off that they acknowledge that you took these notes? It's very important to know what the policies and procedures are for your area because some can do recording and some cannot.
Interesting. And for us, for Title IX Consulting Group, when we have an investigation, we will definitely always record the interviews themselves and then have them transcribed. I know that when I've worked with other campuses, typically I've overseen investigation teams. And what we've always done is meet weekly to go over the best practices and the implementation of the processes that they're going through in each investigation case. And it's always so helpful to record and have the transcribed interviews in hand in case there's any questions or any issues. Do you have a preference, at least I know outside of Title IX Consulting Group, where you've done an investigation? What do you think is that best way to approach these types of questions?
Record and transcribe.
Yeah,
Because taking notes can cut into time and give you silent, awkward spaces. When you're recording and then you transcribe, one, it can be more of a conversation. Um, Sometimes when you're handwriting or the other person's writing, it can be very awkward sitting in the room. Um, so I would prefer record, transcribed, read the little statement ahead of time so that they knew it was being recorded. Things of that nature makes it a lot easier
awesome.
than having to handwrite and have awkward silence.
Yeah, I agree. And there's a big reason why we do it that way here as well for all the cases that we have and will be having. Um, I think the only other thing that I think is important to kind of discuss is what is that relationship between the investigator and the Title IX coordinator? I know that when I've worked in-house for campuses, the investigator and Title IX coordinator, at least my preference, is always to maintain that separation where there is not a close relationship, where the Title IX coordinator hopefully hires an external investigator to come in, but sometimes you have investigators on campus, which is fine too. But the relationship should definitely be considered separate, so that way there is no conflict of interest, at least in my perspective. What about you, Beth? What do you think?
Um, so I worked at smaller colleges and universities, and so that means lots of people wear many hats. For one of them, we put out a notification at the time I was the deputy coordinator, asking who would like to be trained to be an investigator. That was an interesting group that came about. It was faculty, it was staff, we had a house cleaner, um, and they all went, we had 7 of them. That way, when we had a case come up, we could also see if that student or anybody involved knew any of those people, because we would not want to assign them, because we wanted to be a unbiased, this is your first time kind of meeting. With having such a array of people to pick from, it made it much easier. At another college I worked at, we actually had an outside person that came in and only did investigations. So they were hired through the college, but they came in only to do the actual investigations, and there were 2 of them. So they could bounce off each other. But again, that professional understanding, you're not going to see them every day up and down the hallways, things like that. You definitely want to keep that break between who the coordinator is and who the investigator is, because you also don't want anybody to come back and say, well, they took the information down this way because they're friends with. No, it's all professional, it's all trained, it's all information. You just have to make sure everybody has the same knowledge. But you have to also work within the means of the institution or the school you work at. So at smaller schools, sometimes it is tapping those faculty on the shoulder or a staff member or something, to get investigated if you're not to get an investigator if you're not able to hire from outside for an investigator.
Right. And sometimes the Title IX coordinator themselves is the investigator. And in those circumstances, they have to be very, as you stated earlier, very cautious and aware of the fact they have to jot down every single detail to be sure that they're not accused of a conflict of interest in between the Title IX coordinator and investigator role. Have you seen that in any of your experience?
I have seen that, and I will say the people that have been put in that situation, I never was. Um, they did very well. They were very good. They were thorough. And from the beginning, they told everybody what their role was, at what time it was the investigator, at what time it was the coordinator. They were very good at keeping those separated when they were talking to the people involved in the situations. And that had to be extremely hard, because to have to go and wear 2 different hats at the same situation, or even sometimes the same conversation, could be very difficult. So I would always recommend, if possible, to have a coordinator be the coordinator and have investigators that can come in and actually investigate the situation, to let that line be more black and white and not so gray.
Yeah, thank you. I fully agree with that. But I also understand when campuses have limited resources and they have to wear those multiple hats. Um, we do understand the difficulty it may cause on a campus financially to hire an outside consulting group, for the investigation portion. And all of that is so important. Beth, when we're thinking about investigations, I know that you've had 10 years experience. How many cases have you worked on?
At one job, I was a coordinator and investigator, went from investigator to coordinator, and another job, I was just on J boards and did some investigating. So investigations, I've probably done fully, like from start to finish, around 50. Coordinator, probably only around 25, 30, because I was more in the investigator role longer than the coordinator role.
Amazing. Yeah, I think 50 investigations is a whopping number. I know that when I worked at a bigger institution and we saw about, I want to say 300 to 400 cases in the year. Um, and not all of them would become Title IX cases. I can only imagine, as the investigator getting 50, how many cases actually came through that were rejected for Title IX that you ended up seeing in those 50. So it's just an interesting number to think
No
about.
idea. But it was over periods of time, so it was probably 50 within like 8 years.
Okay, so for today, thank you so much, Beth. I think this is a great conversation on investigations. I know there are so many portions to the investigation that we're going to be talking about, and this is just one of those areas that is also important to discuss. That in between where you've got an investigation, getting going, getting started, and selecting that investigator. So thank you.
No problem.